Hey guys, tonight we're taking a slightly unusual journey as we discover why Gen Z culture is, in some surprisingly familiar ways, basically medieval China. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture yourself waking up in Kaifeng during the Song dynasty, one of the largest and most vibrant cities on Earth. The sun has barely risen, yet the streets are already buzzing with life. Merchants are rolling open their shops. Tea sellers are filling the morning air with the comforting scent of freshly brewed leaves, and craftsmen are arranging their finest goods where everyone can admire them. You came here expecting medieval simplicity. Instead, you've accidentally wandered into what feels suspiciously like a shopping district that forgot to invent electricity. If you thought people 1,000 years ago spent every waking moment worrying about famine, invading armies, or whether their roof was leaking, you're only partly right. They also worried about whether their clothes looked outdated. Welcome to medieval China, where trends spread almost as quickly as gossip, and where keeping up appearances could be nearly a full-time occupation. The Song dynasty was one of history's great urban civilizations. Its cities were home to merchants, officials, scholars, artists, craftsmen, and countless ambitious young people hoping to improve their place in society. Everyone wanted to stand out, but preferably in exactly the same fashionable way as everyone else. Sound familiar? Whenever a new style appeared in the capital, people noticed. Travellers carried stories between cities. Merchants brought the newest fabrics. Printed books and illustrated manuals introduced fresh ideas. Before long, people hundreds of miles away wanted exactly the same thing. It was social media without the media. Instead of refreshing your phone every 3 minutes, you refreshed your wardrobe every few months. Fashion changed constantly. Sleeves became wider, then narrower. Hats evolved. Hairstyles shifted. Certain colours suddenly became desirable, while yesterday's favourite look quietly became today's embarrassment. Imagine spending a month's wages on a beautiful robe, only to discover that everyone has decided longer sleeves are now in fashion. Medieval disappointment hit just as hard. Naturally, not everyone could afford genuine luxury. Silk remained expensive, but talented tailors produced clever alternatives for customers who wanted to look wealthy from a respectable distance. History reminds us that inspired by luxury has always been an excellent business model. Your home mattered too. A carefully chosen porcelain vase, elegant lacquer furniture, or a beautifully painted screen quietly announced that you were a person of culture. You didn't have to tell visitors you had excellent taste. You simply positioned your expensive ceramics where absolutely everyone could accidentally notice them. Books played a surprisingly large role in all this. Thanks to advances in woodblock printing, poems, paintings, stories, and fashionable ideas circulated farther than ever before. A respected scholar could influence thousands of people he'd never meet. In modern terms, he was an influencer whose biggest concern wasn't the algorithm. It was whether his brushstrokes looked elegant enough. Of course, if you lived in a remote farming village, trends arrived much more slowly. Your biggest fashion decision might involve choosing the least patched tunic before visiting the market. But in the great cities, staying informed mattered. Knowing what was fashionable signaled that you were educated, connected, and perhaps moving upward in society. As you wander through Kaifeng's crowded streets, you'll quickly realize something rather amusing. Replace printed scrolls with smartphones, substitute market squares for social media feeds, and exchange silk robes for designer sneakers, and the whole scene begins to feel remarkably familiar. The technology has changed dramatically. Human beings, on the other hand, seem to have updated far less often. So you've managed to buy a fashionable robe, your porcelain vase is strategically displayed where every visitor can admire it, and you've memorized a few poems in case someone unexpectedly starts quoting literature over tea. Congratulations. You've officially entered medieval China's version of trying to look interesting. But here's the problem. Trends don't create themselves. Someone has to convince everyone else that a particular hairstyle, painting, poem, or way of drinking tea is suddenly the greatest thing since cooked rice. Enter the influencers. Only they weren't filming 30-second videos. They were writing poetry. In medieval China, especially during the Song dynasty, celebrities certainly existed. Famous poets, painters, calligraphers, musicians, and scholars attracted enormous admiration. Their work was copied, discussed, collected, and sometimes obsessed over by complete strangers. If a celebrated poet praised a scenic mountain, people suddenly wanted to visit it. If an admired painter developed a new artistic style, younger artists eagerly imitated it. Apparently, following your favourite creator has always been part of the human experience. Scholars occupied a particularly curious position. Passing the imperial examinations transformed ordinary young men into respected members of society. Successful scholars didn't just gain government jobs, they became cultural trendsetters. Their handwriting was admired. Their opinions carried weight. Even their taste in tea, gardens, and music could influence wealthy families trying to appear sophisticated. Imagine becoming famous because your handwriting looked especially elegant. Actually, don't. Your wrist already hurts just thinking about it. Artists enjoyed similar prestige. Wealthy collectors competed to purchase celebrated paintings or examples of beautiful calligraphy. Owning an authentic work by a famous master wasn't simply decoration. It quietly informed your guests that you possessed wealth, education, excellent taste, and enough disposable income to spend it on ink rather than another pig. Then there were the famous courtesans. Unlike ordinary entertainers, elite courtesans were often highly educated. Many mastered poetry, music, singing, painting, and conversation. Wealthy merchants and scholars gathered in elegant entertainment districts, not only for company but also for intellectual discussion. A witty conversation with a celebrated courtesan could enhance your reputation almost as much as publishing a respected poem yourself. If that sounds surprisingly modern, that's because reputation has always depended partly on who people see you spending time with. Even emperors occasionally shaped trends without intending to. A ruler's preferences for certain paintings, ceramics, gardens, or fashions often inspired imitation throughout the empire. When the most powerful man in China decided something looked elegant, very few people rushed to disagree. It was an early lesson in influencer marketing, except the influencer also happened to command several 100,000 soldiers. As you walk through Kaifeng, you'll notice that everyone seems to be watching someone else. Scholars admire famous poets. Merchants copy successful officials. Young artists imitate celebrated masters. The platforms may have changed. The followers never really did. By now you've accepted that medieval China had influencers, trendsetters, and enough social pressure to make you second-guess your wardrobe before leaving the house. Unfortunately for your wallet, we're only getting started. If you imagined everyone wearing the same plain robe for decades, history has another surprise waiting. Fashion in medieval China was anything but frozen in time. Styles changed, tastes evolved, and people paid close attention to who was wearing what. Entire industries thrived because someone, somewhere, decided last year's sleeves suddenly looked embarrassingly old-fashioned. You sigh, glance down at your perfectly respectable robe, and immediately wonder whether you've become unfashionable during breakfast. The Song dynasty was an era of extraordinary prosperity. Trade flourished, cities expanded, and workshops produced textiles of remarkable quality. Silk remained the gold standard, but cotton, hemp, and fine woven fabrics offered alternatives for different budgets. Wealthy citizens often owned numerous outfits designed for different occasions, seasons, and ceremonies, because apparently one robe simply wasn't enough to survive medieval society. Colour mattered just as much as the fabric itself. Bright dyes, elegant embroidery, and carefully chosen accessories helped distinguish social status. Certain colours and designs were even restricted by law. The emperor wasn't particularly enthusiastic about ordinary citizens dressing like they ruled the empire. Probably a reasonable policy. Clothing also communicated your profession and education. A scholar looked different from a merchant. An official dressed differently from a craftsman. Before anyone even spoke to you, your appearance offered clues about where you belonged in society, or where you hoped people believed you belonged. Naturally, some people stretched the truth. Wealthy merchants occasionally dressed with almost aristocratic elegance, while ambitious young men tried to imitate respected scholars long before earning the right. Looking successful sometimes came before actually becoming successful. Another tradition that has survived remarkably well. Women's fashion evolved constantly too. Hairstyles became increasingly elaborate, often decorated with jeweled hairpins, combs, fresh flowers, or delicate ornaments crafted from gold and jade. A fashionable hairstyle could require considerable time and assistance to create. After spending 2 hours arranging your hair, you would naturally hope nobody suggested taking a walk during a windy afternoon. Footwear, belts, hats, fans, and jewellery all completed the outfit. None of these details were random. Every accessory subtly communicated refinement, wealth, or personal taste. Even carrying an elegant folding fan could signal education and sophistication, while also serving the practical purpose of helping you survive a crowded summer marketplace. Perhaps the greatest irony is that everyone wanted to appear effortlessly elegant. Achieving that effortless appearance often required expensive fabrics, talented tailors, skilled hairdressers, carefully selected accessories, and enough preparation to make getting ready for a royal wedding seem perfectly reasonable. As you continue through medieval China, you begin to notice something strangely comforting. Every generation believes it has invented fashion. Every generation is wrong. At this point, you've dressed well, learned a few fashionable poems, and successfully pretended to understand expensive art without accidentally turning the painting upside down. Now comes the real challenge. Getting a job. If you're hoping for a comfortable position in the imperial government, there's only one path that truly matters: passing the civil service examinations. These exams were among the most demanding in history, and they shaped the lives of millions of young Chinese men for centuries. Think of them as the world's most stressful college entrance exams, except your entire family's future, your social status, and possibly your marriage prospects are all riding on the result. No pressure. The examination system rewarded knowledge rather than noble birth, at least in theory. If you mastered the Confucian classics, wrote elegant essays, and demonstrated exceptional reasoning, you could rise from an ordinary family to become a respected government official. It was one of the most merit-based systems the medieval world had ever seen. It was also absolutely exhausting. From childhood, students memorized enormous volumes of classical texts. Not summaries, not highlights, the entire works. Day after day, year after year, they copied passages, practiced calligraphy, debated philosophy, and refined their essays until every sentence flowed with perfect balance. Success demanded discipline that bordered on obsession. If you complain about reading 30 pages for school, medieval Chinese students would probably stare at you in complete silence. Then hand you another 5,000 pages. Families invested everything in promising sons. Parents hired tutors whenever they could afford them. Relatives contributed money. Entire households quietly revolved around one student's education because everyone understood what success could bring. A government position meant prestige, financial security, influence, and honor, not just for you, but for your entire family. Failing, however, could be devastating. Some candidates spent decades taking the exams again and again. They travelled hundreds of miles, rented rooms near examination halls, and devoted their adult lives to chasing a single opportunity. Many never succeeded. Imagine preparing for the same final exam until you're 50. Suddenly your high school chemistry test seems almost therapeutic. The examination compounds themselves looked intimidating. Thousands of tiny brick cells stretched in endless rows. During the exams, candidates were locked inside these narrow spaces for days at a time with little more than food, writing materials, and enough determination to keep their sanity from quietly leaving through the window. Cheating was severely punished. Papers were copied by officials before grading, so examiners couldn't recognize handwriting. Candidates were searched before entering. Some even tried hiding notes inside clothing or writing microscopic characters on personal belongings. Apparently, the phrase creative studying techniques has always had its limits. Yet, despite the immense pressure, young people continued chasing this dream generation after generation. Because whether it's earning an imperial degree or refreshing your inbox after submitting job applications, hope has always been one of humanity's strongest motivations. Some things, it seems, never stop being worth the stress. After surviving the imperial examinations, or, more realistically, surviving another week of preparing for them, you begin to notice something curious. People keep staring at your handwriting. Not your face, not your clothes, your handwriting. Welcome to medieval China, where your penmanship could say more about you than your entire personality. In the Song dynasty, beautiful calligraphy wasn't simply considered neat writing. It was one of the highest forms of artistic expression, a reflection of your education, discipline, temperament, and moral character. A few strokes of a brush could convince people that you were wise, refined, patient, and worthy of respect, or that you desperately needed more practice. Imagine applying for your dream job today, only for the interviewer to reject you because the letter G looked slightly overconfident. That isn't far from how seriously calligraphy was taken. Every educated person spent years learning how to hold the brush correctly. The amount of ink mattered. The pressure mattered. The speed mattered. Even the pauses between strokes mattered. Writing wasn't rushed. Every movement was expected to look deliberate and controlled. If you sneezed halfway through a character, history was unlikely to remember it as your finest work. Masters developed recognizable styles that students eagerly copied. Some handwriting appeared bold and energetic, while others favoured elegance and restraint. Collectors admired famous examples almost the way people today admire original paintings or signed memorabilia. Owning a piece written by a celebrated calligrapher instantly elevated your cultural status. Displaying it prominently where visitors could accidentally notice it was, of course, entirely coincidental. Calligraphy also became a surprisingly social activity. Friends exchanged poems written by hand. Scholars gathered to admire each other's brushwork. A beautifully written letter carried emotional weight that went beyond the words themselves. Even an ordinary message became memorable if written with exceptional skill. In many ways, your handwriting became your personal brand. Before anyone met you, they might already know your reputation through your essays, poems, or letters circulating among scholars. A graceful script suggested careful thinking and refined taste. Sloppy writing suggested, well, perhaps a little less refinement. Harsh? Possibly. But remember, these were people who believed self-discipline revealed itself in almost everything you did. The remarkable thing is that calligraphy rewarded patience rather than speed. There was no shortcut, no secret technique, and certainly no magical brush that transformed terrible handwriting overnight. Improvement came from repeating the same movements thousands upon thousands of times until they became second nature. As you watch scholars quietly practicing beside open windows, dipping their brushes into fresh ink before beginning another page, you're reminded that every generation finds a different way to present itself to the world. Today, it might be your profile picture or carefully curated social media page. 1,000 years ago, it was whether you could make one simple character look effortlessly beautiful. Neither was quite as effortless as it appeared. You've dressed well, survived the examination system, and perfected your brushstrokes to the point where complete strangers now compliment your handwriting. Naturally, it's time to find out what everyone is saying about everyone else. For that, you head to the nearest tea house. If medieval China had a social media feed, it probably smelled faintly of jasmine. Tea houses were everywhere, especially during the Song dynasty. They welcomed merchants closing deals, scholars debating philosophy, travellers exchanging stories, artists seeking inspiration, and ordinary people who simply wanted a pleasant place to sit for a while. They weren't just businesses, they were information networks. Walk through the door, and you'll immediately hear conversations flowing in every direction. One table discusses politics, another argues about poetry. Across the room, merchants debate silk prices, while a traveller casually mentions strange customs from a province hundreds of miles away. Within an hour, you've learned 3 new recipes, 2 business opportunities, and at least 5 scandals involving people you've never met. Some things never lose their appeal. News travelled surprisingly fast through these gathering places. Before newspapers became widespread, information often spread by conversation. Travellers carried stories from distant regions. Officials discussed recent government decisions. Merchants shared rumours about changing markets. Of course, not every story was entirely accurate. Someone always knew someone whose cousin had personally witnessed something extraordinary. Whether that cousin actually existed remained wonderfully unclear. Tea itself became an experience rather than simply a drink. Connoisseurs debated which leaves came from the finest mountains, which water produced the best flavour, and exactly how tea should be prepared. Entire books were written on the subject. Imagine ordering a cup of tea and accidentally starting a 40-minute discussion about mineral content. Actually, don't. That conversation probably still exists somewhere. Entertainment filled many tea houses as well. Professional storytellers recounted famous battles, ghost tales, romantic adventures, and historical dramas. Musicians performed elegant melodies, while audiences listened between conversations. Some establishments even hosted performers who attracted regular crowds eager for the latest story. If a storyteller introduced an especially exciting tale, word spread quickly across the city. Soon, everyone wanted to hear it. Congratulations! You've just witnessed a medieval viral trend. Tea houses also provided something every society needs: a place to see and be seen. Wearing your finest robe suddenly made more sense when dozens of people might notice it. Scholars hoped influential officials would recognize them. Merchants searched for wealthy customers. Young people quietly observed potential marriage prospects without making it too obvious. Or at least they hoped it wasn't obvious. As evening settles over the city and lanterns begin glowing outside the tea house windows, you realize these lively rooms offered far more than warm drinks. They connected people. And whether those connections happen across polished wooden tables or glowing phone screens, human beings have always found a comfortable place to exchange ideas, share stories, and politely discuss everyone else's business. After spending several evenings in tea houses, you've started to feel rather sophisticated. You can discuss poetry. You nod thoughtfully whenever someone mentions philosophy. You even hold your teacup with what you believe is impressive elegance. Then someone invites you to dinner. You immediately realize you've been promoted from casual observer to active participant in medieval China's unofficial competition for who can host the most impressive meal. Because food wasn't just about staying alive, it was about making a statement. The Song dynasty witnessed an explosion of culinary creativity. Prosperous cities supported hundreds of restaurants serving regional specialties from across the empire. If you had enough money, you could enjoy dishes from distant provinces without ever leaving the capital. It was the medieval equivalent of deciding you suddenly wanted Italian food while sitting in Tokyo. Trade made this possible. Merchants transported spices, fruits, seafood, fine wines, and luxury ingredients over enormous distances. Wealthy families took pride in serving unusual delicacies that demonstrated both their wealth and their connections. If your guests asked, "Where did you find this?" you were already winning. Banquets became elaborate performances. One course followed another, each carefully arranged to surprise and delight. Fish might be carved into artistic shapes. Dumplings resembled flowers. Cakes were decorated with astonishing precision. Someone had clearly decided that eating should involve just enough hesitation to admire the presentation before destroying it completely. Hosts paid close attention to balance. Sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and aromatic flavors were carefully combined. Color mattered almost as much as taste. A beautiful table reflected refinement, patience, and education. simply piling food onto a plate like a small mountain was generally not considered elegant. Although, privately, everyone probably wanted the mountain, restaurants competed fiercely for customers. Some became famous for a single signature dish. Others attracted visitors with beautiful gardens, musicians, or spectacular views overlooking rivers and canals. Travelers often wrote enthusiastic descriptions of memorable meals, helping popular establishments build reputations far beyond their own cities. Apparently, 5-star reviews existed long before stars became part of the rating system. Even ordinary people enjoyed following food trends whenever they could afford them. Seasonal treats became highly anticipated. New cooking techniques spread between regions. Families experimented with recipes they had heard about from travelers or read in printed collections. Food was entertainment. Food was conversation. Food was culture. Of course, not everyone shared in this abundance. Farmers and poorer labourers continued eating simple meals centred on rice, millet, vegetables, and whatever protein they could obtain. The luxurious banquets of wealthy officials belonged to a different world entirely. Still, whether your dinner consisted of an extravagant feast or a humble bowl of noodles, one thing remained remarkably familiar. People loved discovering exciting new foods, and they loved telling everyone else where they had eaten even more. Some traditions, it seems, are simply too delicious to disappear. After attending fashionable dinners, sipping expensive tea, and pretending you completely understood abstract poetry, you've discovered one final requirement for becoming truly sophisticated. You need stuff. Not useful stuff. Interesting stuff. Welcome to the wonderfully expensive hobby of collecting. In medieval China, especially during the Song dynasty, collecting beautiful objects became something of an obsession among scholars, wealthy merchants, and government officials. Owning rare items wasn't simply about showing off your wealth. At least, that was the official explanation. Unofficially, showing off was certainly helping. The most sought-after treasures included porcelain, paintings, calligraphy, jade carvings, bronze antiques, rare books, unusual stones, and finely crafted inkstones. A single object could become famous if people believed it had once belonged to a celebrated poet or respected emperor, because apparently history's oldest marketing strategy is simply saying, "A famous person touched this." Scholars spent years searching for the perfect painting, or the most elegant ceramic bowl. They discussed tiny details that most people would never notice: the colour of the glaze, the balance of a brushstroke, the texture of polished jade. You stare politely at a small porcelain cup while everyone around you nods with admiration. It looks very cup-shaped. Fortunately, nobody asks for your opinion. Some collectors became experts capable of identifying genuine masterpieces from clever imitations. Others were considerably less successful. Forgers quickly realized that wealthy people were willing to pay extraordinary sums for rare antiques. Before long, workshops were producing convincing copies of ancient bronzes and ceramics. Buyers proudly displayed their 200-year-old treasure, occasionally unaware that it had been completed sometime around last Tuesday. Counterfeit collectibles have been disappointing optimistic buyers for centuries. Collecting wasn't always a solitary hobby either. Friends gathered to admire each other's newest acquisitions, compare paintings, exchange books, and debate which artist deserved greater recognition. These meetings became social events where conversation flowed almost as freely as the tea. Naturally, everyone tried very hard to appear completely relaxed about owning incredibly rare objects. "Oh, this old painting. I almost forgot I had it." You absolutely did not forget you had it. Books became prized possessions as well. Thanks to advances in printing, more people could build personal libraries than ever before. Owning shelves filled with history, philosophy, poetry, and science quietly demonstrated both education and curiosity. Visitors immediately noticed. Conveniently, the shelves were usually positioned where visitors could hardly miss them. At this point, you've managed to look fashionable, speak intelligently about poetry, survive several tea-house debates, and perhaps even exchange a few meaningful glances with someone across a lantern-lit garden. You feel like you're fitting in. Then your host casually invites you to visit his home. Within about 30 seconds, you realise you've been outclassed. Because in medieval China, success wasn't always announced with words. It was displayed. The Song dynasty produced one of the wealthiest urban societies the medieval world had ever seen. Trade flourished, businesses expanded, and successful merchants accumulated fortunes that rivaled those of old aristocratic families. Naturally, everyone wanted others to know they were doing well, preferably without appearing too eager. This delicate balancing act became an art form. A respected scholar's home might contain elegant wooden furniture, carefully arranged paintings, polished bronze vessels, shelves filled with books, and a small indoor garden designed to create an atmosphere of effortless refinement. The key word being effortless, because nothing says effortless quite like spending several months planning exactly where to place a flower pot. Gardens themselves became powerful status symbols. Wealthy families invested enormous sums creating peaceful landscapes with winding paths, decorative rocks, bamboo groves, lotus ponds, and carefully shaped trees. The goal wasn't simply beauty. It was creating a place that suggested its owner possessed enough wealth to spend valuable land on something other than growing food. An impressive luxury in any century. Even pets reflected status. Exotic birds with beautiful songs, rare fish swimming through ornamental ponds, and unusual animals occasionally appeared in elite households. Owning something uncommon quietly reminded visitors that your connections and your budget extended well beyond the ordinary. Although convincing a particularly stubborn bird to sing on command was apparently much harder than purchasing it. Clothing continued to play its role as well. Fine silk robes, embroidered belts, jade ornaments, and carefully crafted shoes all communicated social standing before you even introduced yourself. The trick was appearing elegant without crossing the invisible line into looking arrogant. A line that everyone claimed to understand. A line that very few consistently found. Perhaps the most valuable status symbol, however, wasn't something you could buy. It was time. Having enough leisure to paint, compose poetry, study philosophy, tend a garden, host elegant gatherings, or practice calligraphy suggested you weren't trapped by the daily struggle to earn your next meal. Free time itself became a quiet display of success. Ironically, many wealthy people worked tirelessly to create the appearance that they never had to work at all. As you leave another beautifully decorated home, you begin noticing the pattern. People weren't collecting beautiful things simply because they enjoyed them. They were carefully telling a story about themselves. Today that story might be told through luxury cars, designer watches, perfectly curated homes, or carefully edited social media photos. 1,000 years ago, it was told through silk robes, porcelain, gardens, and libraries, different props, exactly the same audience. And just like today, everyone insisted they weren't trying to impress anyone, while hoping everyone noticed anyway. You've explored elegant gardens, admired priceless paintings, and politely pretended to understand why one particular porcelain bowl is apparently more exciting than all the other porcelain bowls. Now you're ready for a night out, and medieval China has no shortage of options. One of the biggest surprises waiting for you is just how entertained people expected to be. The great cities of the Song dynasty weren't quiet places where everyone stayed home, reading Confucius by candlelight. They were filled with music, laughter, performances, festivals, storytellers, and crowds looking for the next exciting attraction. If anything, people were remarkably good at finding reasons not to stay home. As evening falls, lanterns illuminate busy streets, while entertainment districts come alive. Tea houses fill with audiences listening to professional storytellers recount famous battles, ghost stories, romantic adventures, and legendary heroes. The best performers don't simply read from a script They perform. Their voices rise and fall dramatically. They imitate different characters. They pause at exactly the right moment, leaving the audience desperate to hear what happens next. Congratulations. You've just discovered the medieval version of ending every episode on a cliffhanger. Musicians are equally popular. Skilled performers play instruments such as the guqin, pipa, flutes and drums, filling restaurants and gardens with elegant melodies. Wealthy families often invite musicians to private banquets, while public performances attract crowds throughout the city. Some songs become incredibly fashionable. You can't stop hearing them. Eventually you begin wondering whether ancient people also complained. They keep playing the same tune everywhere. The answer is almost certainly yes. Theatre flourishes as well. Early forms of Chinese opera combine music, dance, colourful costumes, comedy, and dramatic storytelling into unforgettable performances. Audiences cheer for heroes, laugh at clever servants, and eagerly discuss memorable scenes long after the actors leave the stage. If one production becomes especially successful, everyone wants tickets. Apparently sold-out shows existed long before online booking systems found creative ways to crash. Acrobats and street performers gather wherever crowds assemble. Jugglers toss impossible numbers of objects into the air. Skilled martial artists demonstrate astonishing techniques. Magicians perform tricks that leave audiences scratching their heads, convinced real spirits must somehow be involved. The magician, naturally, never explains. Professional wrestling may reveal its secrets. Professional magic never does. Children gather around puppet shows while adults gamble on games of strategy or watch competitive board games played by astonishingly talented masters. Even flying kites evolves into both recreation and artistic expression, with elaborate designs decorating the skies during festivals. As you wander through the lively streets, you realise entertainment isn't simply filling spare time, it's creating shared experiences. Tomorrow morning, everyone will be talking about the funniest storyteller, the most spectacular acrobat, or the actor who completely stole the show. 1,000 years later, the conversations sound remarkably similar. Only now, instead of recommending a performance at the local theatre, someone sends you a link. After weeks of exploring medieval China, you've reached a sensible conclusion. This civilization never seems to stop celebrating. Every time you think the city might finally enjoy a quiet weekend, someone hangs lanterns across the streets, musicians appear from nowhere, food stalls multiply overnight, and half the population heads toward a festival. You weren't even invited, you just followed the crowd. Fortunately, so did everyone else. Festivals were some of the most anticipated moments of the year. They marked religious celebrations, seasonal changes, harvests, imperial birthdays, and countless local traditions. Entire cities transformed themselves. Streets became rivers of people, markets expanded, performers filled every open square, and merchants prepared months in advance for the enormous crowds. Missing one wasn't simply disappointing. It meant spending the next several weeks listening to everyone else describe how amazing it was. The Lantern Festival stood among the grandest celebrations. As darkness fell, thousands upon thousands of lanterns illuminated streets, bridges, gardens and temples with glowing reds, golds, and soft whites. Some lanterns were simple. Others resembled dragons, birds, flowers, or entire miniature buildings crafted by remarkably patient artisans. You stop to admire one particularly beautiful lantern, then another, then another. 3 hours later, you've somehow walked only 2 streets. Festival food became an attraction in its own right. Vendors sold sweet pastries, roasted chestnuts, dumplings, noodles, candied fruit, steamed buns, and regional specialties that people eagerly searched for each year. Certain treats only appeared during particular festivals, making them even more desirable. Apparently, limited-time menus have been emotionally manipulating customers for centuries. Games and competitions filled every available space. Families solved lantern riddles for prizes. Children chased colourful toys through crowded streets. Musicians competed for audiences, while storytellers tried to gather the largest crowds with tales of heroes, ghosts, or impossible romances. Of course, everyone wanted to attend the most popular performances. Nobody wanted to discover afterward that another storyteller had been even better. Sound familiar? Festivals also offered something increasingly rare in everyday life. Everyone was together. Scholars stood beside merchants. Craftsmen wandered alongside wealthy officials. Travellers mixed with local families. For a brief moment, people from very different backgrounds shared the same music, the same food, and the same excitement. It created memories people talked about for months, perhaps even longer, if something especially unusual happened. As you make your way home beneath glowing lanterns, carrying a snack you definitely didn't plan to buy, you notice the streets are still full despite the late hour. Nobody seems eager for the celebration to end, because human beings have always feared missing the moment everyone else will remember. Today, that feeling might arrive through photos, videos, and endless social media posts. 1,000 years ago, it arrived when your neighbour cheerfully began a sentence with, "You should have been there," and somehow made those 4 words feel like the greatest tragedy of the entire dynasty. After attending enough banquets, festivals, and tea houses, you've started recognising familiar faces around the city: the famous poet, the respected scholar, the wealthy merchant with the impressive garden, the man who insists every conversation somehow returns to his porcelain collection. Then one morning, everyone is talking about someone else. Not because they accomplished something remarkable, because they embarrassed themselves. You quickly learn that reputation in medieval China wasn't something you owned forever. It was something you had to protect every single day. Confucian society placed enormous importance on honour, dignity, proper behaviour, and what historians often describe as saving face. While the exact idea was more complex than the modern expression, your public image mattered tremendously. How people viewed your character could influence friendships, business opportunities, marriage prospects, and even your career. One foolish mistake had a habit of becoming everyone's favourite conversation. Tea houses helped with that. News travelled astonishingly fast through crowded cities. An official who accepted an obvious bribe, a scholar caught behaving dishonourably, or a merchant accused of cheating customers could find their reputation damaged almost overnight. There were no trending hashtags. There were, however, thousands of people who enjoyed repeating an interesting story, which often proved just as effective. Scholars especially lived under constant scrutiny. They were expected to embody Confucian virtues: honesty, humility, respect, self-control, and integrity. Passing the imperial examinations earned admiration, but it also meant people expected exemplary behaviour. Imagine finally achieving your dream job, only to discover everyone now expects you to be morally flawless. That sounds exhausting. Public criticism wasn't always official. Friends, neighbours, colleagues, and local communities quietly judged behaviour every day. Gossip acted as an invisible form of social pressure. Nobody wanted to become known as dishonest, arrogant, irresponsible, or lacking proper manners. And once a reputation formed, changing it could take years. Literature often reinforced these values. Plays, poems, and popular stories praised loyal friends, faithful spouses, honest officials, and selfless heroes, while greedy or corrupt characters usually received endings that served as gentle reminders not to imitate them. History had surprisingly little patience for villains who refused to learn their lesson. Of course, rumours weren't always fair. Sometimes stories grew larger every time they were retold. A small misunderstanding became a dramatic scandal after passing through enough conversations. By the time the tale reached the other side of the city, even the original participants might struggle to recognize it. Apparently, exaggeration has enjoyed remarkable historical consistency. As you continue walking through the busy streets, you begin noticing that people are constantly managing how others perceive them. They choose their words carefully, behave respectfully in public, dress appropriately, and avoid unnecessary conflict whenever possible. Not because they were pretending to be someone else, because reputation was one of the few possessions that couldn't simply be purchased once it was lost. Whether it's medieval gossip spreading through tea houses, or modern opinions spreading across the internet, one lesson remains surprisingly unchanged. People may forget what you wore. They rarely forget what they heard about you. By now, you've probably reached an unavoidable conclusion. Medieval China feels surprisingly modern. People followed trends. They obsessed over reputation. They chased careers, collected expensive hobbies, worried about relationships, and attended every festival they could find. Surely, you think, there must be one major difference. Then you overhear an elderly scholar complaining about young people, and suddenly, everything makes perfect sense. Every generation in medieval China believed the next one was changing too quickly. Older scholars often grumbled that young students cared more about appearances than genuine learning. They worried that fashionable clothes, elegant parties, and popular entertainment distracted people from serious study. Some argued that ancient virtues were being forgotten as cities became wealthier and more comfortable. Apparently, kids these days is one of humanity's oldest surviving traditions. Confucian thinkers regularly encouraged young people to practice humility, discipline, and respect for elders. Those ideals had existed for centuries, but every new generation had to hear them all over again. Because every older generation quietly assumes they were the last sensible people to ever exist. Young scholars, meanwhile, didn't necessarily see themselves as irresponsible. They simply grew up in a different world. The Song dynasty was richer, more urban, and more connected than many earlier periods. New technologies, expanding trade, and growing cities naturally changed how people dressed, worked, and socialized. Progress has a habit of making previous generations uncomfortable. Printing is a perfect example. Older intellectuals sometimes worried that books becoming easier to obtain would somehow reduce the value of learning. If knowledge became too accessible, would students appreciate it as deeply? You can almost hear the conversation. When I was your age, we copied every page by hand. And we respected the brush. Modern students suddenly feel very fortunate. Fashion created similar debates. Every few years, someone insisted that clothing styles had become too extravagant. Hairstyles were criticized for being excessive. Luxury goods were blamed for encouraging vanity. History's wardrobe complaints have shown remarkable consistency. Entertainment also came under attack. Popular storytelling, music, theatre, and public performances attracted enormous audiences. But conservative voices occasionally warned that people were spending too much time having fun instead of improving themselves. Imagine being told you're enjoying yourself incorrectly. Some criticisms were undoubtedly reasonable. Rapid economic growth created inequality, encouraged excessive spending, and tempted some people to pursue status over character. Every prosperous society faces those challenges. Others, however, sound remarkably familiar because they were less about facts and more about nostalgia. Every generation remembers its youth a little more fondly than it probably deserves. As you prepare to leave medieval China, one final realization quietly settles in. Throughout history, young people have embraced new ideas, while older generations have worried about where those ideas might lead. Neither side has ever completely stopped doing either. Which means that if someone transported a Song dynasty scholar into the 21st century, he would probably spend about 15 minutes trying to understand your smartphone. And the next 3 hours explaining why your generation reads far too little and spends entirely too much time looking at it. As your journey through medieval China comes to an end, you take one last walk through the streets of Kaifeng. The tea houses are full, merchants are calling out to customers, students hurry past with books tucked under their arms. A famous storyteller is already drawing a crowd. Somewhere nearby, a wealthy collector is proudly showing off a porcelain vase he absolutely insists he bought because he appreciates the craftsmanship. Not because he wanted everyone else to admire it. Certainly not. When you first arrived, comparing Gen Z to medieval China probably sounded ridiculous. After all, one world runs on artificial intelligence, smartphones, and high-speed internet. The other relied on horses, handwritten letters, and candlelight. But once you look beyond the technology, the similarities become surprisingly difficult to ignore. People wanted to belong. They followed trends because trends helped them feel connected. They admired influential figures because everyone looks for people worth imitating. They carefully presented themselves to the world, hoping others would see them in the best possible light. They worried about what people thought. They celebrated new fashions. They stressed over exams. They obsessed over hobbies. They searched for love. They argued about politics. They collected things they probably didn't need. And yes, they occasionally spent far too much money trying to impress people they didn't even like. Human beings have always been remarkably committed to making life more complicated than necessary. It's tempting to believe every generation is completely unique. We often hear that today's young people are unlike anyone who came before them, that social media changed everything, that modern life created entirely new behaviours. History gently disagrees. The platforms changed, the speed changed, the technology changed. The people, not nearly as much. The desire to fit in, to stand out, to build a reputation, to chase success, and to find a community stretches back thousands of years. Medieval Chinese scholars sought approval from respected teachers, just as today's creators hope for positive comments. Festival crowds gathered for shared experiences, just as millions now gather around global events online. Famous poets influenced fashion just as celebrities influence it today. The stage became larger. The audience became global. The performance itself remained surprisingly familiar. Perhaps that's the most comforting lesson history has to offer. Every generation believes it's living through completely unprecedented times. Every generation invents new tools, new styles, and new ways of communicating. Yet beneath all those changes, people continue laughing at the same jokes, worrying about the same futures, falling in love the same way, and wondering whether everyone else has life figured out better than they do. Spoiler alert. The people of medieval China didn't. Neither did their grandparents. Neither do we. Imagine waking up in ancient Rome, Athens, or Alexandria and discovering that half the city is talking about you before you've even finished breakfast. Not because you accomplished something extraordinary, not because you committed a crime, but because someone, somewhere, confidently told a story that sounded just believable enough to spread. Long before newspapers printed sensational headlines or social media rewarded outrage with endless attention, humanity had already perfected the art of gossip. The technology was different. The psychology was exactly the same. Every civilization had its own version of the rumour mill. In Greece, it gathered beneath the shaded colonnades of the agora, where philosophers debated lofty ideas only a few steps away from fishmongers debating who was secretly bankrupt. In Rome, the forum buzzed with politicians, merchants, lawyers, veterans, and idle spectators, all eager for the latest scandal. Egypt had temple courtyards filled with priests, pilgrims, and scribes. Across the ancient world, markets functioned as shopping centres, newsrooms, and comment sections rolled into one. And unlike today's anonymous online accounts, rumours came wrapped in a far more convincing package. My cousin heard it from a legionary. A merchant arriving from Corinth swears it's true. A servant in the governor's household saw everything. Whether any of these people actually existed was another matter entirely. Ancient societies depended almost completely on word of mouth. Most people could not read, and even among those who could, official announcements were rare and slow to circulate. If 20 travellers arrived from another city carrying the same exciting story, very few listeners stopped to ask whether all 20 had simply copied the first storyteller. After all, exciting stories travel much faster than accurate ones. Human beings have always preferred a dramatic explanation over a boring fact. The senator quietly retired because of poor health is respectable enough. The senator was poisoned after insulting the emperor's mistress guarantees a crowd before lunchtime. You might think educated people were immune to this. They were not. Some of history's greatest philosophers repeated colourful rumours without much investigation. Historians often included outrageous tales simply because they were too entertaining to ignore. Even Roman emperors employed professional rumour campaigns to shape public opinion. Character assassination was not merely casual entertainment. It became a political weapon capable of toppling careers, destroying marriages, provoking riots, and sometimes ending lives. Because in the ancient world, your reputation often mattered more than the truth itself. And once a story escaped into a crowded marketplace, catching it again was about as easy as chasing a chicken through the streets of Rome while wearing formal toga. If any city in the ancient world deserved the title of gossip capital, Athens would have been a strong contender. It was a place where ideas changed civilizations, democracy was born, and citizens could spend hours discussing philosophy, politics, or whether their neighbour's son was secretly taking bribes. You might picture ancient Athens as a city filled entirely with wise old philosophers, calmly debating the meaning of life beneath marble columns. The reality was considerably noisier. The heart of the city was the agora, a sprawling marketplace that served as Athens' commercial, political and social centre. Farmers sold olives beside potters displaying fresh wares. Politicians argued with rivals, while merchants haggled over prices. Sailors returning from distant ports shared tales that grew more dramatic with every retelling. Somewhere nearby, Socrates might be questioning someone's understanding of justice, while, just around the corner, 2 shopkeepers whispered that a prominent citizen had been seen leaving another man's wife a little too late in the evening. The Athenians loved conversation. Unfortunately, conversation did not always require evidence. Their democracy encouraged ordinary citizens to discuss public affairs, which meant politicians lived under constant public scrutiny. Reputation could determine whether someone won an election, lost a lawsuit, or found himself ostracised from the city altogether. Every ambitious statesman understood that defeating an opponent with clever speeches was useful. Damaging his character before the speech even began was often even better. One of the most famous victims was Pericles, the celebrated leader who guided Athens during its golden age. His political enemies rarely attacked only his policies. Instead, they spread stories about his private life, mocked his appearance, and targeted his companion Aspasia, portraying her as a dangerous foreign influence, manipulating Athenian politics from behind closed doors. Whether these accusations held any truth mattered less than the fact that people repeated them. Comic playwrights eagerly joined the spectacle. Public theatre became an acceptable place to ridicule famous citizens before thousands of spectators. Politicians, generals, philosophers, and wealthy families all found themselves transformed into punchlines. Imagine attending a comedy show only to discover that half the script consisted of jokes about your personal life. Ancient Athenians called that entertainment. The remarkable part is how familiar it all feels. Public opinion was shaped not only by facts, but by wit, repetition, and emotion. Once enough people laughed at a rumour or repeated it over dinner, it acquired a strange kind of credibility. Athens celebrated free speech as one of its greatest achievements, but that same freedom also ensured that rumours could roam the city just as freely as philosophers themselves. As Athens demonstrated how gossip could shape democracy, Rome transformed it into something far more dangerous, an instrument of power. By the time the Roman Republic evolved into an empire, reputation had become a form of currency. A respected name could win elections, attract wealthy allies, and open the doors of the Senate. A ruined name could leave a man politically finished before he ever had the chance to defend himself. You didn't always need to eliminate your enemies. Sometimes you simply had to make everyone stop trusting them. Rome offered countless places for rumours to flourish. The forum overflowed with lawyers arguing cases, merchants selling imported luxuries, veterans swapping war stories, and politicians giving speeches. Public baths served as enormous social clubs where men of every class relaxed for hours. Barbershops buzzed with conversation, taverns echoed with exaggerated tales, and servants carried snippets of overheard conversations from one wealthy household to another. Information travelled with astonishing speed. A senator might leave a private dinner believing his secrets were safe, only to discover the following morning that half the city seemed remarkably well informed. Political campaigns were especially vicious. Candidates rarely limited themselves to promoting their own achievements. Instead, they quietly encouraged stories, questioning an opponent's courage, honesty, family, or morals. Anonymous poems mocking public figures appeared overnight on walls. Satirical verses circulated through the streets. Nobody signed their name, but everyone knew exactly who was being targeted. The Romans even had a word for damaging someone's reputation through public insult and slander: fama. Originally, it simply meant report or reputation, but it could just as easily describe the invisible force carrying whispers across the city. The poet Virgil imagined Fama as a terrifying winged creature covered in countless eyes, ears, and mouths. By day she watched everything. By night she flew through the darkness, spreading truth and lies with equal enthusiasm. It was one of history's most accurate metaphors for gossip. Roman historians understood this perfectly. Tacitus frequently noted that rumours surrounded emperors, generals, and noble families. Sometimes he admitted that the stories were impossible to verify, yet he recorded them anyway, because they revealed what people believed, or wanted to believe. That distinction mattered enormously. A false accusation repeated often enough could influence court decisions, military appointments, or even succession to the throne. Once public opinion shifted, facts struggled to catch up. The Romans built magnificent roads that connected an empire stretching across 3 continents. Along those same roads travelled soldiers, merchants, officials, and travellers carrying another valuable cargo. Not grain, not gold. Stories. And some of those stories proved far more destructive than any Roman legion. If ordinary Romans had to worry about neighbourhood gossip, emperors faced something far more relentless. Every meal, every marriage, every illness, every public appearance became raw material for rumours that spread across an empire of millions. The higher you climbed, the less privacy you possessed. An emperor might command dozens of legions and rule territories stretching from Britain to Egypt, yet he could still lose control of the story people told about him. Take Augustus, Rome's first emperor. He understood better than anyone that power depended not only on armies, but on image. After decades of bloody civil war, he carefully presented himself as a modest servant of the Republic rather than an absolute monarch. Coins displayed his face, poets praised his virtues, public monuments celebrated peace under his leadership. It was, in many ways, history's first great public relations campaign. His enemies responded with rumours. Some whispered that Augustus had manipulated his way to power through secret murders. Others claimed he quietly eliminated rivals while pretending to restore traditional Roman values. Whether true or exaggerated, these stories refused to disappear. Every successful ruler attracted suspicion almost as naturally as admiration. Things became even more dramatic under later emperors. Consider Tiberius. During the final years of his reign, he withdrew from Rome to the island of Capri. His absence created a vacuum, and rumours rushed in to fill it. Soon lurid tales spread describing extravagant feasts, bizarre cruelty, and shocking private behaviour. The historian Suetonius eagerly recorded many of these stories decades later. But here is the problem. How many actually happened? Modern historians remain deeply divided. Some accounts may contain kernels of truth. Others were likely invented by political enemies or embellished by writers who understood that scandal sells. After all, the emperor quietly spent the afternoon reviewing tax records, rarely survives the centuries. The emperor hosted an outrageous secret banquet overlooking the sea, tends to receive considerably more attention. Then came Nero, perhaps the greatest victim and beneficiary of Roman rumour. After the Great Fire of Rome in 64, whispers spread that Nero himself had ordered the city burned to make room for a magnificent new palace. Others claimed he stood watching the flames while performing songs about the fall of Troy. There is little reliable evidence that either story happened. Yet 2,000 years later, countless people still picture Nero calmly playing music as Rome burned around him. That is the extraordinary power of gossip. A rumour repeated often enough does more than damage a reputation. Sometimes it replaces reality altogether. And once history begins repeating the story, separating fact from fiction becomes one of the hardest tasks any historian can face. Most rumours disappear within days. Ancient rumours had a remarkable habit of surviving for centuries. The reason was surprisingly simple. In a world without recordings, photographs or interviews, later generations depended almost entirely on whatever earlier writers chose to preserve. If those writers disliked someone, their opinion often became history itself. You can almost imagine the scene. A historian sits at his desk decades after an emperor has died. Witnesses are gone. Official documents have vanished. All that remains are old stories, political speeches, private letters, and rumours repeated so often they have started sounding like facts. What should he believe? Sometimes the answer was, why not write down all of it? One of the greatest examples is Suetonius, whose collection The 12 Caesars remains one of our richest sources for the early Roman emperors. His biographies are endlessly entertaining. They are filled with outrageous anecdotes, embarrassing scandals, strange habits, and colourful gossip. You learn which emperor supposedly enjoyed lavish feasts, who feared thunderstorms, who insulted senators, and who allegedly behaved in ways that would have fueled an entire year's worth of modern tabloids. The problem is that Suetonius rarely tells us how much of it he actually verified. He often introduces a story with phrases like, "it is said," or "many believed." Those few words should make every historian pause. Tacitus, another brilliant Roman historian, was generally more cautious, Yet even he occasionally recorded rumours because they revealed public opinion. He understood that whether a story was true or false, people acted on what they believed. A false accusation could spark a rebellion just as easily as a genuine crime. In other words, rumours had historical consequences, even when they were completely invented. Character assassination became especially easy after someone died. A deceased emperor could no longer deny the accusations. A disgraced politician could no longer defend his reputation. Victorious rulers often encouraged writers to portray defeated rivals as monsters, fools, or tyrants. Every new dynasty had an incentive to make the previous one look terrible. After all, replacing a villain always makes your own rise appear far more heroic. As a result, some historical figures remain trapped inside stories written by their enemies. Modern historians spend countless hours comparing texts, archaeological evidence, coins, inscriptions, and official records, trying to separate exaggeration from reality. Sometimes they succeed, sometimes they don't. Because once gossip enters the historical record, it becomes astonishingly difficult to remove. Long after the whispers have faded from the streets, they continue echoing through books, classrooms, documentaries, and conversations, reminding us that history does not simply preserve the past. It also preserves humanity's favourite stories, whether they happened or not. If there was one rule that remained remarkably consistent across the ancient world, it was this: powerful women attracted extraordinary rumours. The more influence a woman appeared to possess, the more outrageous the stories became. Sometimes the accusations had a grain of truth. More often they revealed far more about the fears of the storytellers than about the women themselves. Take Cleopatra, perhaps the most famous victim of character assassination in all of history. Ask someone today how she gained power, and you'll often hear the same answer: beauty and seduction. Yet the real Cleopatra was far more formidable. She spoke multiple languages, understood economics, commanded fleets, negotiated with foreign rulers, and navigated one of the most dangerous political landscapes of the ancient Mediterranean. She inherited a kingdom surrounded by Rome's expanding influence and managed to preserve Egypt's independence for nearly 2 decades. That alone should have made her famous. Instead, many Roman writers preferred another story. After Octavian defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra, he faced a political challenge. Rome had just endured another brutal civil war. He needed Romans to believe they had not fought fellow citizens, but had instead defeated a dangerous foreign queen who had bewitched one of their greatest generals. It was brilliant propaganda. Suddenly, Cleopatra became the exotic temptress from the East. She was portrayed as manipulative, extravagant, immoral, and almost magically capable of controlling powerful Roman men. Antony, according to this version, had not made poor political decisions of his own. He had simply fallen under her spell. Conveniently, this narrative made Octavian look like the saviour of Rome. Cleopatra never had the opportunity to answer these accusations. The Roman version largely survived because Rome won. She was hardly alone. Fulvia, the wife of Mark Antony, earned a reputation for being overly ambitious simply because she participated in politics during a time when many believed women should remain in the background. Livia, wife of Augustus, became the subject of persistent whispers, claiming she poisoned rivals to secure the throne for her son Tiberius. Ancient historians repeated these suspicions, yet modern scholars have found remarkably little evidence to support many of them. Still, the rumours endured. Ancient audiences loved dramatic villains, and a politically influential woman often fit the role perfectly. The pattern feels surprisingly familiar. Confident women were labelled manipulative. Intelligent women were called dangerous. Successful women were accused of secret schemes that supposedly explained achievements others struggled to accept. 2,000 years later, historians continue untangling fact from fiction. But one truth is difficult to ignore. Sometimes the greatest weapon used against a powerful woman was not an army, a dagger, or a courtroom. It was simply a story that refused to die. Most gossip destroys a friendship. Ancient gossip occasionally destroyed entire kingdoms. When diplomacy depended on trust, and trust depended on reputation, a carefully planted rumour could become as dangerous as an invading army. Kings, generals, and ambassadors all understood that information was a weapon. Sometimes it was far cheaper to poison an enemy's reputation than to fight his soldiers. One of the oldest examples comes from the Persian Wars. As the vast Persian Empire expanded westward, the Greeks told endless stories about Persian rulers. Kings like Xerxes were described as impossibly arrogant, endlessly luxurious, and surrounded by unimaginable wealth. Some accounts were certainly based on reality. Others grew more extravagant every time they crossed the Aegean Sea. The Persians were not simply enemies. They became symbols of everything Greeks claimed they were not. Meanwhile, Persian courts likely heard equally colourful stories about the quarrelsome Greek city-states. Tiny kingdoms constantly arguing among themselves hardly appeared capable of serious resistance. Underestimating an opponent often begins with believing flattering stories about yourself. Rumours also played a crucial role during the rise of Alexander the Great. As his armies marched deeper into Asia, stories travelled ahead of them. Some claimed Alexander was unstoppable because he descended from the hero Heracles. Others insisted he was the son of Zeus himself. In Egypt, priests welcomed him as the son of the god Amun, strengthening this extraordinary image. Did everyone literally believe he was divine? Probably not. But the rumour itself served an important purpose. If soldiers believed their commander possessed divine favour, confidence soared. If enemies believed they faced a man protected by the gods, hesitation could spread before the battle even began. Perception became part of warfare. The Romans perfected this strategy. Before invading new territories, they often portrayed rival leaders as savage, treacherous, or irrational. Julius Caesar's own writings about Gaul carefully emphasized the dangers posed by Celtic tribes. While many descriptions reflected genuine military threats, they also helped justify years of expensive campaigning back in Rome. A terrifying enemy made an ambitious conquest seem necessary rather than opportunistic. Political rumours worked inside empires as well. False reports of an emperor's death could trigger rebellions hundreds of miles away. Whispers that a governor planned to betray the throne caused armies to change loyalties overnight. Sometimes these stories proved completely false, but by the time the truth arrived, battles had already been fought. That may be the most remarkable thing about ancient rumours. They rarely needed to be true. They only needed enough people to believe them long enough to change history. Once swords were drawn and kingdoms marched to war, correcting the original story became almost irrelevant. By then, the damage had already become part of history itself. You might assume that after centuries of archaeological discoveries and careful historical research, most ancient rumours have finally been laid to rest. Not quite. Some of history's most famous facts are actually old pieces of gossip that have simply enjoyed an exceptionally long life. Take Nero. Ask almost anyone what he did while Rome burned, and you'll likely hear the same answer. He fiddled as flames consumed the city. There's just one small problem. The violin would not be invented for well over 1,000 years. Ancient writers actually claimed Nero sang while accompanying himself on a stringed instrument called a cithara. Even that story remains highly questionable. Some sources place him miles away from Rome when the fire began, while others say he returned quickly to organise relief efforts, opening public buildings to shelter those who had lost their homes. None of those details are nearly as memorable as the image of a mad emperor serenading a burning city. So that version survived. Or consider Caligula. He is often remembered as the emperor who appointed his horse Incitatus as a senator. It is one of history's favourite examples of imperial insanity. Except there is very little evidence that it actually happened. Ancient sources suggest Caligula planned to honour his prized horse with extravagant gifts, and perhaps joked that the animal would make a better senator than many of the men serving in Rome. Given the emperor's sharp sense of mockery, it would not have been entirely out of character. Somewhere along the way, satire became accepted as literal history. Then there is the infamous story of Marie Antoinette, supposedly declaring, "Let them eat cake." Although she lived many centuries after the ancient world, her example perfectly illustrates how character assassination works across history. There is no reliable evidence she ever uttered those words, yet they became attached to her because they perfectly matched the public image her enemies wanted to create, an arrogant ruler completely detached from ordinary people. The lesson is timeless. People rarely remember the most accurate version of events. They remember the most satisfying one. Historians constantly wrestle with this problem. Every inscription uncovered, every forgotten letter translated, and every archaeological discovery forces old assumptions to be questioned. Sometimes long-repeated stories collapse under the weight of new evidence. Other times they remain stubbornly alive simply because they are too entertaining to abandon, and perhaps that is gossip's greatest victory. A rumour does not truly succeed when everyone believes it. It succeeds when people stop asking whether it was ever true in the first place. Even after 2,000 years, some of the ancient world's most successful character assassinations continue shaping how we remember the people who can no longer defend themselves. If you stepped into the ancient world believing that only modern society can cancel someone, you would be in for a rude surprise. Ancient civilizations had their own methods of erasing reputations. They simply lacked hashtags. When a person's public image became damaged beyond repair, the consequences could be devastating. A politician might lose an election before casting a single speech. A merchant could see customers quietly disappear. A general might never receive another command. Friends became cautious. Allies vanished. Even relatives sometimes kept their distance, unwilling to be associated with someone whose name had become toxic. In Rome, one of the harshest punishments was something called damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. Although the term itself was coined by modern historians, the practice was very real. If the Senate declared a ruler or public figure an enemy of the state after death, statues could be smashed. Names were chiselled off monuments, portraits were destroyed, coins bearing their likeness were melted down or withdrawn from circulation. Modern life often gets blamed for inventing stress. Deadlines, traffic, bills, endless notifications. The neighbour who decides that 6 a.m. is the perfect time to begin drilling into concrete. It is tempting to imagine that ancient people lived simpler lives, free from the anxieties that fill our own days. They did not. Stress is far older than civilization itself. Imagine waking up as a farmer in ancient Egypt. The Nile's flood determines whether your family will eat well next year or struggle through months of hunger. Too little water brings famine. Too much destroys your fields. You have almost no control over either. Now picture yourself as a merchant in Athens. Your cargo ship has disappeared somewhere in the Aegean Sea. Pirates may have attacked it. A storm may have sunk it. Weeks pass with no news, and every passing day threatens financial ruin. Or perhaps you are a Roman soldier stationed hundreds of miles from home. You have no idea when you will see your family again. Every patrol beyond the frontier carries the possibility that you simply won't return. Stress was everywhere. Parents worried about sick children. Craftsmen feared losing customers. Politicians dreaded public humiliation. Kings wondered whether trusted advisors were secretly plotting against them. Even emperors, who possessed unimaginable wealth and power, often slept poorly, knowing that history offered remarkably short careers for unpopular rulers. The ancient world lacked hospitals filled with specialists, professional therapists, and books promising 7 easy steps to inner peace. Yet its people understood something remarkably important. The human mind cannot remain under constant pressure forever. Every civilization eventually discovered that surviving physically was not enough. People also needed ways to recover emotionally. They needed moments of silence after chaos, laughter after hardship, companionship after loneliness, and hope after disappointment. Without realizing it, they developed many of the same coping strategies psychologists recommend today. They exercised. They spent time with friends. They walked through gardens. They attended festivals. They prayed. They listened to music. They shared meals. They found meaning in rituals that gave structure to uncertain lives. Of course, they also occasionally blamed their bad mood on an angry god or an unlucky constellation, which probably made family arguments considerably more dramatic. Still, beneath those different beliefs, the emotional needs remained strikingly familiar. Across Greece, Rome, Egypt, China, and countless other civilizations, people searched for the same thing we search for today. Not a life without problems, but enough peace, comfort, and resilience to face tomorrow when it arrived. Once ancient people accepted that life would always bring hardship, they searched for places where those burdens could be set down, even if only for a little while. That is where temples entered the story. To modern eyes, an ancient temple may seem like little more than a religious building filled with statues, incense, and priests. But for the people who walked through those massive stone doorways, it was often something much more personal. It was a refuge. Imagine leaving behind the crowded streets of Athens. The shouting merchants fade into the distance. The clatter of carts grows quieter. As you climb toward the sanctuary of Athena, the air itself seems calmer. Marble columns rise above you. Birds replace the noise of the marketplace. And for the first time all day, nobody is asking you to buy anything. That alone is enough to lower your blood pressure. The Greeks believed the gods were present within these sacred spaces. Whether you came seeking advice, forgiveness, or simply a moment of quiet reflection, entering a temple created a clear mental boundary between ordinary life and something greater. The Egyptians felt something similar. Their enormous temples were carefully designed to slow visitors down. Long processional avenues, towering gateways, dimly lit halls, and the scent of burning incense guided people away from everyday concerns. The deeper you walked into the temple, the more the outside world seemed to disappear. Modern architects might call this environmental psychology. Ancient priests simply called it sacred design. Some sanctuaries specialized in healing both body and mind. One of the most famous stood at Epidaurus in Greece, dedicated to Asclepius, the god of medicine. Pilgrims travelled from across the Mediterranean hoping to recover from illness or emotional suffering. They bathed, offered sacrifices, and eventually slept inside special chambers, believing the god would visit them in dreams and reveal a cure. Whether divine intervention actually occurred is impossible to know, but hope itself can be remarkably therapeutic. Even the Romans, often remembered for conquest and engineering, maintained small household shrines called lararia. Every morning families paused before these little altars to honour their household gods. A brief prayer, a tiny offering of wine or bread, perhaps a few moments of gratitude before beginning another demanding day. It was a daily ritual that brought consistency to an unpredictable world. Not every prayer was answered. Not every illness disappeared. Yet these sacred places gave people something equally valuable, a feeling that they were not carrying life's burdens alone. Sometimes the greatest comfort was not certainty that everything would be fine. It was simply believing that someone, whether a god, an ancestor, or the universe itself, was listening in the silence. Temples offered peace through silence. Festivals offered peace through noise. After weeks or even months of hard labour, ancient people understood that the mind needed something different from routine. Fields still had to be ploughed, walls repaired, taxes paid, and children fed. But every so often, society collectively agreed on something surprisingly healthy. Work could wait. Across the ancient world, calendars were filled with festivals that interrupted ordinary life. Some honoured the gods. Others celebrated the harvest, military victories, or the changing seasons. Whatever the reason, they all accomplished something remarkably similar. They gave people permission to stop worrying. Perhaps nowhere was this more obvious than during Rome's Saturnalia. Held each winter in honour of Saturn, the god of agriculture, Saturnalia turned Roman society upside down for several unforgettable days. Schools closed. Many businesses stopped operating. Gambling, normally restricted, became acceptable. Small gifts were exchanged. Homes were decorated with greenery, and enormous feasts stretched late into the evening. Most famously, social roles temporarily blurred. Masters often served food to their slaves, who were allowed to joke freely with their owners without fear of punishment. It was not true equality, and once the festival ended, Roman society quickly returned to normal. But for a brief moment, laughter replaced hierarchy. Even the strictest Roman might spend the day wearing a colourful cap instead of his usual serious expression. The Greeks found their own escape through festivals honouring Dionysus, the god of wine, theatre, and celebration. Thousands gathered to watch dramatic tragedies and outrageous comedies performed in enormous open-air theatres. They laughed together, cried together, and watched stories of heroes overcoming impossible hardships. Aristotle would later argue that tragedy produced catharsis, an emotional cleansing that allowed audiences to release fear and sorrow. In other words, ancient Greeks were discovering the therapeutic value of a really good performance. Egyptian festivals were equally vibrant. During celebrations like the Opet festival, sacred statues of the gods were carried through the streets in magnificent processions. Musicians filled the air with drums, harps, and flutes. Families shared food, dancers performed, and entire cities transformed into places of celebration rather than work. Modern psychologists often speak about the importance of breaking routine to prevent burnout. Ancient civilizations arrived at the same conclusion through experience. After months of responsibility, people needed moments that reminded them life contained more than obligations. Music, food, friends, laughter. The festivals eventually ended, of course. Farmers returned to their fields, merchants reopened their shops, and soldiers resumed their duties. But they returned, carrying something invisible, a lighter mind. Sometimes the most effective way to cope with stress was not solving every problem. It was setting those problems aside for a few precious days and remembering what joy felt like before facing them again. Once the music faded and the festivals came to an end, ancient people returned to ordinary life, carrying something almost as valuable as celebration itself: each other. Long before psychologists spoke about the importance of social support, people instinctively understood that worries became lighter when they were shared. They might not have used words like mental health or emotional resilience, but they recognized a simple truth. No one was meant to carry life's burdens alone. In ancient Greece, friendship was considered one of life's greatest treasures. Philosophers wrote extensively about it. Aristotle even argued that true friendship was essential for a good life, suggesting that wealth and power meant very little if you had nobody with whom to share them. That philosophy extended far beyond the classroom. The Greek symposium was one of the most important social traditions. After dinner, friends gathered to drink diluted wine, discuss politics, philosophy, poetry, music, or simply tell stories about their day. Some conversations became deeply intellectual. Others almost certainly ended with someone insisting they could sing much better after their fourth cup of wine. History suggests they usually could not. The point was never perfection. It was companionship. Rome developed similar customs. The evening meal, known as the cena, often became the social highlight of the day. Families reunited after work, while friends and neighbours gathered for long dinners that stretched well into the evening. Wealthy Romans hosted elaborate banquets, but even ordinary households found comfort in eating together. Sharing bread, olives, vegetables, cheese and conversation created something far greater than the meal itself. It created belonging. In smaller villages across Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa, life naturally encouraged daily interaction. Neighbours met while collecting water, grinding grain, tending animals, or working nearby fields. News spread quickly, but so did support. If someone fell ill or suffered a poor harvest, relatives and neighbours often stepped in to help. Community acted as a safety net long before governments attempted the same. Stories also became medicine. Around evening fires, grandparents passed down legends of heroes who endured impossible hardships, clever tricksters who escaped disaster, and ordinary people who found hope after tragedy. Listening to these tales reminded audiences that suffering was temporary, courage was possible, and others had survived difficult times before them. Modern therapists sometimes encourage people to talk through their problems. Ancient people often achieved something remarkably similar without realizing it. A shared meal, a trusted friend, a quiet conversation beneath the stars. None of these erased life's hardships, but they made those hardships feel less lonely. Sometimes the greatest comfort was not receiving perfect advice. It was simply hearing another voice say, "Sit down, eat with us. Tomorrow will be easier if we face it together." Good friends could lift your spirits. But sometimes the ancient world believed the best remedy was simply to get your body moving. Thousands of years before scientists discovered how exercise releases chemicals that improve mood, ancient civilizations had already noticed something surprisingly obvious. People who stayed active often handled life's difficulties better than those who remained idle. To the Greeks, physical fitness was about far more than preparing for war. Exercise was considered essential for a balanced life. Throughout Greece, cities built gymnasiums where citizens trained, wrestled, ran, threw javelins, and practiced discus. These were not merely sports facilities. They were social centres, schools, and places where philosophy often mixed with physical activity. A young man might spend the morning practicing wrestling before listening to a lecture on ethics or mathematics. The Greeks believed the body and mind developed together. A healthy body supported clear thinking. A disciplined routine strengthened character. Even philosophers appreciated a good walk. Aristotle famously taught while strolling with his students through shaded pathways, giving rise to the peripatetic school, whose members literally learned while walking. Conversation seemed to flow more naturally when the feet were moving as well. Modern research would probably approve. The Romans shared this appreciation for movement, although they approached it somewhat differently. Military training demanded incredible endurance. Legionaries marched astonishing distances carrying heavy equipment, built roads and camps after exhausting journeys, and drilled constantly with weapons heavier than those used in real combat. While their motivation was military effectiveness rather than stress management, the physical activity itself helped release tension accumulated through long campaigns. Even civilians stayed surprisingly active. Without cars, elevators, or delivery services, daily life required constant movement. People walked to markets, climbed stairs in crowded apartment buildings, carried water, tended gardens, and worked with their hands. Physical exertion was woven naturally into ordinary routines, rather than squeezed into a scheduled hour before breakfast. The ancient Olympic Games reflected another important truth. Competition itself could be joyful. Watching athletes achieve extraordinary feats inspired entire communities. Victories brought celebration, admiration, and a shared sense of pride that extended far beyond the individual competitor. Of course, not every workout looked graceful. Some beginner wrestlers undoubtedly discovered muscles they never knew existed. Others probably learned that confidence alone does very little against an opponent twice your size. Certain lessons never change. Today, doctors recommend walking, running, swimming, or lifting weights to reduce stress and improve emotional well-being. Ancient people would not have understood words like endorphins or serotonin. But after a long walk beneath olive trees, a vigorous wrestling match, or an afternoon working in the fields, they recognized the feeling immediately. The world itself had not become any easier. Yet somehow, they had become stronger, calmer, and more prepared to face it. Exercise strengthened the body, but ancient people also discovered another remedy that required far less effort. Sometimes the best way to quiet a restless mind was simply to step away from the crowd. Cities like Rome, Athens, Alexandria, and Babylon were anything but peaceful. Streets echoed with shouting merchants, clattering carts, barking dogs, hammering blacksmiths, and endless conversations. Markets overflowed with people, while political debates could become so heated that keeping a safe distance occasionally seemed like an excellent survival strategy. Even 2,000 years ago, people needed a break from the noise. The wealthy Romans often escaped to country villas whenever they could. These estates were not simply symbols of luxury. They offered something many city dwellers desperately craved: silence. Surrounded by vineyards, olive groves, gardens, and flowing streams, visitors could read, walk, fish, or simply sit beneath the shade of towering trees. Writers like Pliny the Younger described the deep satisfaction of leaving Rome behind for a few peaceful days, where the only urgent decision involved choosing whether to stroll through the orchard before or after lunch. It was a remarkably healthy dilemma. The Greeks found comfort in nature as well. Sacred groves surrounded many temples, and philosophers frequently held discussions outdoors instead of inside buildings. Plato's Academy was famous for its shaded gardens, where students learned while birds sang overhead and gentle breezes cooled the afternoon air. Learning, they believed, was easier when the mind felt relaxed. The ancient Chinese reached similar conclusions. Taoist thinkers encouraged people to observe rivers, mountains, forests, and changing seasons. Nature represented balance. A flowing stream did not fight every obstacle. It simply moved around it. Watching the natural world reminded people that constant struggle was not always the wisest response to life's difficulties. Music also played an important role. Greek philosophers believed certain melodies could influence emotions and restore inner harmony. Pythagoras argued that music reflected mathematical order within the universe itself. Whether performed on a lyre, flute, harp, or simple reed pipe, Music was thought to calm the soul as much as it entertained the ear. Even soldiers marching home from distant campaigns often sang together, easing exhaustion one verse at a time. Today, many people take walks in parks, listen to calming playlists, or spend weekends hiking through forests to escape daily pressures. Ancient people would have recognized the impulse immediately. They may not have spoken about reducing cortisol levels or practicing mindfulness. Instead, they simply understood that the mind, much like the body, occasionally needed fresh air, beautiful sounds, and moments when absolutely nothing important was expected of it. Sometimes, healing began with something as simple as sitting beneath a tree and allowing the world to slow down for a little while. Nature offered an escape from stress. Eventually, though, everyone had to return home. That was when another ancient coping strategy quietly took over: routine. Life in the ancient world was unpredictable. Crops failed, diseases appeared without warning, armies marched across borders, ships vanished at sea. One bad harvest could undo years of hard work. Against so much uncertainty, people found comfort in the few things they could control. How they began the day, how they ended it. The small rituals repeated over and over until they became anchors in an otherwise uncertain world. For many Romans, the morning started at the household shrine. Nearly every family, rich or poor, honoured the Lares and Penates, the guardian spirits believed to protect the home. A small offering of wine, a piece of bread, or a brief prayer took only moments, but it marked the transition from sleep to work. Before facing clients, business deals, or political arguments, families paused together in a familiar routine that had been repeated by generations before them. It created stability. The Greeks had similar habits. Many households lit lamps at sunset, offered thanks to Hestia, goddess of the hearth, and gathered around the evening fire before bed. The glowing hearth represented warmth, safety, and family. No matter what chaos unfolded beyond the front door, the fire reminded everyone that home remained a place of protection. Even bedtime itself followed surprisingly regular patterns. Without electric lighting, most people naturally aligned their schedules with the sun. They rose shortly after dawn, and often went to bed not long after darkness settled. During the hottest months, especially around the Mediterranean, many also rested during the afternoon, when the blazing sun made heavy work exhausting. The body recovered because it was allowed to. Sleep, however, was never guaranteed. Ancient writers occasionally described insomnia, nightmares, and anxious thoughts. Roman philosopher Seneca admitted that worry could keep even the wealthiest person awake. The physician Galen advised patients suffering from restlessness to avoid overeating, maintain regular habits, exercise moderately, and spend time in calm surroundings. His advice would not sound particularly out of place in a modern health magazine. People also found comfort in familiar evening rituals. Some read poetry aloud, others listened to music or family stories. Children heard the same legends repeated night after night, while older relatives reflected on the day's events. These predictable moments created a sense of order in lives that rarely felt fully under control. Today, experts often recommend consistent sleep schedules and calming bedtime routines to reduce stress. Ancient people arrived at the same conclusion through experience. They could not control tomorrow's harvest, the weather, or the decisions of kings, but they could light the evening lamp, gather around the fire, say a familiar prayer, and go to bed believing that, whatever tomorrow brought, they would meet it one day at a time. Temples offered hope, festivals brought joy, friends shared your burdens. But there was one ancient method of coping with stress that asked an entirely different question. What if the problem wasn't the world around you? What if it was the way you looked at it? This idea became the foundation of several ancient schools of philosophy, and for countless people, philosophy was not an abstract subject discussed only by scholars. It was practical medicine for the mind. Few people embraced this more completely than the Stoics. Founded in Athens and later embraced by many Romans, Stoicism taught that suffering often came not from events themselves, but from our reactions to them. You could not control storms, illness, politics, or the opinions of other people. Spending your energy trying to control the uncontrollable only created more anxiety. Instead, focus on what belongs to you, your choices, your actions, your character. Everything else must be accepted with calm determination. The Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius practiced this every day. Despite ruling an empire constantly threatened by wars, disease, and political conspiracies, he filled his private journal with reminders to remain patient, humble, and rational. He wrote these thoughts for himself, not for publication. Reading them today almost feels like looking into someone's private therapy notebook. Another Stoic philosopher, Epictetus, had once been born into slavery. Despite enormous hardships, he repeatedly taught that freedom began inside the mind. Someone might imprison your body, but they could never truly imprison your judgment unless you surrendered it willingly. That was an extraordinary idea. Not everyone agreed with the Stoics. The Epicureans offered a different path. Contrary to popular myth, they did not encourage endless luxury or wild parties. Epicurus argued that lasting happiness came from simple pleasures: good friends, modest meals, meaningful conversations, and freedom from unnecessary fear. Wealth and fame often produced more anxiety than satisfaction. Sometimes enough really was enough. Even Socrates contributed to this ancient search for inner peace. By constantly questioning assumptions, he encouraged people to examine their worries instead of blindly obeying them. Fear often became smaller once it was carefully investigated. It is remarkable how familiar these ideas sound. Modern psychology teaches people to separate what they can control from what they cannot. Therapists encourage challenging irrational thoughts. Mindfulness emphasizes observing emotions without letting them completely take over. The vocabulary has changed. The wisdom has not. Ancient philosophers never promised a life without hardship. They promised something far more realistic: a mind trained well enough to remain steady when hardship inevitably arrived. And perhaps that is why their words continue comforting readers more than 2,000 years after they were first written. By now, one thing has become impossible to ignore. The ancient world never discovered a miracle cure for stress. Instead, it discovered something far more realistic. To be a Roman citizen was one of the greatest honours in the ancient world. Kings sought it. Generals rewarded it. Entire cities celebrated when they finally received it. Across the vast Roman Empire, millions of people dreamed of hearing the words, "Civis Romanus sum," I am a Roman citizen. Those 4 words could protect you from certain punishments, grant legal rights unavailable to others, and instantly raise your social standing wherever Roman law prevailed. Citizenship opened doors that remained firmly closed to slaves, foreigners, and many provincial subjects. It sounded like winning the ancient world's most exclusive membership. But like many prestigious memberships, it came with a rather demanding list of conditions. Being a Roman citizen was not simply about enjoying privileges. It was about carrying expectations every single day. Imagine waking up in Rome as an ordinary citizen. Before breakfast, your responsibilities have already begun. You must protect your family's reputation, earn an honest living, obey Roman law, participate in civic life when required, maintain relationships with patrons and clients, and ensure your children grow into respectable members of society. If your family owns property, there are financial obligations to meet. If Rome calls upon your generation to serve, military duty may await. If you seek public office, every decision will be judged by neighbours, rivals, and voters who rarely miss an opportunity to criticise. And if you bring shame upon your household, you are not the only one who suffers. Your parents feel it. Your children inherit it. Even your ancestors, whose names have been honoured for generations, seem to lose a little of their dignity. The Romans believed citizenship carried moral responsibilities as much as legal ones. A good citizen was expected to place the needs of the Republic, or later the Empire, ahead of personal comfort. Courage, discipline, loyalty, honesty, and respect for family were not simply admired qualities. They were considered essential duties. Of course, living up to those ideals proved rather more difficult than reciting them. Roman streets were filled with ambitious politicians chasing power, merchants chasing wealth, soldiers chasing glory, and ordinary citizens simply trying to avoid bankruptcy before the next tax collector appeared. Human nature, it turns out, has always been wonderfully complicated. The Romans proudly claimed that citizenship distinguished them from the rest of the world. In many ways, it did. But behind the legal protections and public prestige stood something far less glamorous. A lifetime spent balancing rights with responsibilities, personal ambition with public duty, and individual happiness with the constant pressure of living up to the name of Rome itself. For a Roman citizen, wearing that title was an honour. Carrying its weight was another matter entirely. If Roman citizenship brought prestige, Rome expected something in return. The empire was not held together by marble temples or magnificent legions alone. It was held together by millions of ordinary citizens doing what Rome expected them to do. Every citizen owed the state something. Sometimes it was money, sometimes it was labour, sometimes it was loyalty, and occasionally it was all three at once. One of the most important responsibilities was participating in the census. Every few years, Roman officials known as censors recorded citizens, their families, their property, and their wealth. At first glance, it may have looked like little more than ancient paperwork. In reality, it determined much of your life, your social class, your political influence, your military obligations, even the amount you contributed to the state. The Romans took this process extremely seriously. Lying about your wealth or attempting to avoid registration could bring severe penalties. More importantly, it branded you as someone unwilling to fulfill your duty to Rome. That stain on your reputation could last far longer than any financial punishment. Contrary to popular belief, not every Roman citizen paid the same taxes throughout Roman history. During much of the Republic, citizens living in Italy paid relatively little direct taxation after Rome's overseas conquests filled the treasury with tribute from conquered provinces. Provincial populations often carried the heavier tax burden. But that did not mean Roman citizens escaped financial responsibilities. There were customs duties on imported goods, local municipal taxes, inheritance taxes under the empire, and countless indirect expenses tied to civic life. Wealthy citizens were often expected to sponsor public games, repair buildings, finance religious festivals, or contribute to community projects. Refusing was legal in some cases. Doing so enthusiastically damaged your standing far more effectively than any official fine. The richer you became, the more society expected from you. Public generosity became a form of unwritten taxation. If your hometown needed a new fountain, wealthy citizens often paid for it. If an amphitheatre required repairs, influential families stepped forward. If games were organised, someone had to finance the entertainment. These acts earned admiration, political influence, and lasting prestige. They also emptied plenty of purses. For ordinary citizens, daily obligations never seemed to end. Markets had rules to follow, contracts had to be honoured, military equipment might need maintaining. Neighbourhood associations collected contributions for religious ceremonies and local events. Rome rewarded responsibility. It also noticed neglect. Being a Roman citizen meant living with the understanding that your relationship with the state was never one-sided. Rome protected your rights, enforced your contracts, and recognised your status. In return, Rome expected you to contribute to the machine that made all of those privileges possible. Citizenship, in Roman eyes, was never something you simply possessed. It was something you continually earned through duty. Paying taxes was one obligation. Being asked to fight for Rome was another entirely. For much of Roman history, citizenship and military service went hand in hand. If the Republic needed soldiers, eligible citizens were expected to answer the call. There was no convenient way to pretend you had suddenly become unavailable. "Sorry, I already have plans this weekend," was unlikely to impress a Roman consul preparing for war. Rome believed that the rights of citizenship had to be defended by the citizens themselves. In the early Republic, military service was not a profession. It was a duty. Farmers left their fields, craftsmen closed their workshops, and merchants put aside their business to join the army. Campaigns often began in the spring and ended before winter, allowing soldiers to return home in time for the harvest. At least that was the plan. Wars have a remarkable habit of ignoring schedules. As Rome expanded across Italy and then the Mediterranean, campaigns grew longer. A war against Carthage or a rebellion in Spain could last for years. Every additional season spent away from home meant neglected farms, struggling businesses, and anxious families wondering whether their husbands, fathers, or sons would ever return. Victory brought glory, but glory did not weed the fields, nor did it repair a leaking roof or help raise young children. Military service demanded enormous personal sacrifice long before a soldier ever reached the battlefield. The equipment itself often represented a significant investment. In the Republic, many citizens were expected to provide their own armour and weapons according to their wealth. Those with greater means served as heavily armed infantry, while poorer citizens fought with lighter equipment or supported the army in other ways. Even before the first sword was drawn, serving Rome could be expensive. Then came the reforms of Gaius Marius in the late 2nd century before Christ. The army gradually became professional. The state supplied equipment, and soldiers served for long periods, often around 16 to 20 years, and eventually even longer under the empire. Military service became a career rather than a temporary civic obligation. That solved some problems. It created others. A young man might spend decades stationed in distant provinces like Britain, Syria, or the Rhine frontier. He would miss weddings, funerals, births, and countless ordinary moments that quietly shape a family. Letters travelled slowly, if they arrived at all. Every knock at the door could bring welcome news or devastating loss. Yet, despite the hardship, countless Roman citizens served willingly, because they believed that protecting Rome meant protecting their own homes. The empire's borders were not simply lines on a map. They were the distant walls defending every family, every farm, and every citizen who slept peacefully because someone else stood watch through the night. Serving Rome demanded courage, but surviving the battlefield was only half the challenge. Once you returned home, another battle awaited, protecting your family's honour. To a Roman citizen, reputation was not something you owned alone. It belonged to your entire family. Every action, every business deal, every marriage, every public argument, and every careless decision reflected upon parents, siblings, children, and even ancestors who had been dead for generations. You were never simply representing yourself. You were carrying your family's name everywhere you went. The Romans had several words for this idea. Dignitas referred to the respect and personal prestige someone earned through honourable conduct and public achievement. Existimatio described a person's standing in society, the way others judged their character and trustworthiness. Neither could be purchased. Both could be lost surprisingly quickly. Imagine you are a merchant in Rome. You cheat one customer. By sunset, half the neighbourhood has heard about it. The next morning, buyers begin choosing another stall. Potential business partners become cautious. A family arranging a marriage for their daughter quietly decides your household is no longer respectable enough. Your mistake has spread far beyond your own wallet. The Romans never underestimated the speed of gossip. Public opinion mattered enormously because so much of Roman life depended on trust. Contracts were often sealed with witnesses rather than endless paperwork. Loans relied upon confidence. Political careers depended on reputation. Military promotions rewarded proven character as much as bravery. If people stopped believing your word, rebuilding that confidence could take years. For aristocratic families, the pressure became even greater. Noble households proudly displayed wax masks of distinguished ancestors inside their homes. During funeral processions, actors even wore these masks to remind spectators of the family's glorious history. Imagine walking past portraits of ancestors who had served as consuls, victorious generals, or celebrated statesmen every single day. That creates rather high expectations. Failure did not feel private. It felt like disappointing centuries of family history. Marriage carried similar pressure. Choosing a spouse was rarely viewed as a purely romantic decision. Families considered wealth, political alliances, reputation, and social standing. A careless marriage could damage relationships carefully built over generations. Love certainly existed, but practical considerations usually received an invitation to the wedding as well. Even children learned these lessons early. Roman parents constantly reminded their sons and daughters that their behaviour reflected upon the entire household. Good manners, discipline, honesty, and self-control were not simply personal virtues. They protected the family's good name. Because once honour was damaged, recovering it proved far more difficult than earning money or rebuilding a house. In Rome, fortunes could disappear and be made again. Political careers could recover. Even cities destroyed by war could be rebuilt. But a tarnished reputation often proved to be the hardest thing of all to restore. Protecting your family's honour was difficult enough. The problem was that Rome never allowed you to stop competing. From the moment you entered adult life, you were measured against everyone around you. Your neighbours noticed how successful your business became. Your relatives compared your career to that of your cousins. Your patrons judged your loyalty. Your clients judged your generosity. Even complete strangers felt perfectly entitled to have an opinion about how well you were living your life. In Rome, success was rarely private. Neither was failure. Ambition sat at the very heart of Roman culture. The Republic, and later the Empire, rewarded citizens who distinguished themselves through military victories, political service, business success, or public generosity. Every achievement increased your standing. Every setback risked becoming tomorrow's conversation at the baths. For wealthy Romans, the competition was relentless. Young aristocrats dreamed of climbing the cursus honorum, the traditional ladder of public office. They hoped to become quaestors, praetors, and perhaps, if fortune smiled upon them, consuls. But these positions were fiercely contested. Winning required money, influential friends, persuasive speeches, and years of careful networking. Losing happened in front of everyone. Imagine spending years building your reputation, financing public games, greeting voters every morning, and delivering speeches throughout the forum, only to watch another candidate receive the victory. There was no quiet acceptance speech. There was simply the long walk home while the city already discussed why you had failed. For ordinary citizens, life offered different contests. Merchants competed for customers, lawyers competed for clients, craftsmen competed for contracts. Every marketplace became a silent battlefield where reputation determined who prospered and who struggled. The pressure to appear successful could become overwhelming. Roman writers frequently warned against excessive luxury and endless displays of wealth. Yet society also admired visible success. A fine house, elegant clothing, educated children, and well-hosted dinners all announced that you were thriving. Keeping up appearances became a responsibility in itself. It is hardly surprising that some citizens borrowed money they could barely repay simply to maintain their social standing. Appearances mattered, perhaps more than they should have. Even philosophers noticed the problem. Seneca repeatedly warned that many Romans exhausted themselves chasing public approval instead of genuine happiness. He observed that people often feared criticism more than poverty itself, allowing the opinions of strangers to control their peace of mind. His words remain surprisingly modern. Because while Rome lacked newspapers, television, or social media, it possessed something just as powerful: an audience. And every Roman citizen lived much of their life on that stage, hoping for applause, fearing embarrassment, and quietly wondering whether everyone else had somehow become more successful than they had. Competing with your fellow citizens was exhausting. The trouble was, you could rarely escape their attention. Rome was not a place where you could quietly disappear for a few days and hope nobody noticed. Whether you lived in a bustling city or a smaller provincial town, someone was almost always watching. Your neighbours, your clients, your patrons, your rivals, sometimes even complete strangers who simply enjoyed minding other people's business. Privacy, at least as we understand it today, barely existed. Take a walk through the streets of Rome. Apartment buildings called insulae rose several stories high, with families living practically on top of one another. Thin walls allowed arguments, celebrations, crying babies, barking dogs, and occasionally questionable singing to travel with remarkable ease between apartments. If you sneezed particularly enthusiastically, there was a fair chance someone 2 floors away would wish you good health. The streets themselves offered little relief. Markets overflowed with merchants shouting prices. The forum buzzed with lawyers, politicians, and spectators. Temples attracted worshippers throughout the day. Even a simple trip to buy bread often turned into an unexpected social gathering, because you inevitably met friends, relatives, customers, or neighbours before reaching home. The Roman baths made matters even more public. Far more than places to wash, they functioned as enormous social clubs where citizens exercised, discussed politics, negotiated business deals, exchanged gossip, and formed new friendships. Rich and poor mingled in surprisingly close quarters. If people wanted to know what was happening in the city, they often learned it while soaking in warm water. It was difficult to keep secrets when everyone relaxed together every afternoon. Public ceremonies created even more opportunities to be seen. Religious festivals, triumphal processions, funerals, elections, gladiatorial games, theatrical performances. Attendance mattered. Your absence might be noticed just as much as your presence. Were you avoiding someone? Had your family fallen into financial trouble? Were you ill, or simply unfashionably late? Someone would almost certainly invent an explanation. The Romans even had a saying that reputation travelled faster than truth. They understood that once gossip escaped into the streets, Calling it back was almost impossible. This constant visibility encouraged good behaviour in many cases. People honoured contracts because others were watching. Parents disciplined children because the neighbourhood noticed. Merchants maintained fair dealing because customers remembered. But living under permanent observation also carried a cost. Every mistake became public. Every embarrassment found an audience. Every awkward moment risked becoming tomorrow's entertainment. For a Roman citizen, the hardest judge was not always the law. Sometimes it was simply the crowd, quietly watching, forming opinions, and remembering far more than you wished they would. Living under the watchful eyes of Roman society was exhausting, but the greatest pressure often waited behind your own front door. Because being a Roman citizen did not simply mean taking care of yourself. It meant carrying the future of your entire family. In Roman society, the family was the foundation of everything. Before there was loyalty to a political party or even to the emperor, there was loyalty to the household. Every generation was expected to leave the family stronger than they had found it. That was easier said than done. At the centre of the Roman home stood the paterfamilias, the male head of the household. His authority was immense. He managed family finances, arranged marriages, oversaw property, directed religious rituals within the home, and made decisions that affected everyone living under his roof. It was an extraordinary amount of responsibility. A wise father could guide several generations toward prosperity. A foolish one could ruin decades of hard work with a handful of poor decisions. Every Roman parent worried about their children. Would their sons become honourable citizens? Would they earn respect instead of disgrace? Would their daughters marry into good families? Would the family name continue to be spoken with admiration? These questions occupied Roman households constantly. Education became part of that responsibility. Boys learned reading, writing, law, and public speaking if their families could afford it. They also learned discipline, respect for tradition, and the importance of keeping one's word. Fathers often reminded their sons that they were not merely preparing for a career. They were preparing to represent generations of ancestors. Daughters carried enormous expectations as well. They were expected to manage households efficiently, raise children, maintain family relationships, and contribute to the honour of both the family they were born into and the one they married. Marriage was rarely viewed as the end of responsibility. It simply transferred much of it elsewhere. Financial pressure never disappeared either. A poor harvest, a failed business venture, or an unexpected illness could threaten an entire household. There were elderly parents to support, young children to feed, slaves or workers to supervise if the family owned them, and property that required constant maintenance. Someone always depended on you. Roman writers frequently praised the citizen who sacrificed personal comfort for the good of his family. Buying fewer luxuries to educate a son, working longer hours to provide a better dowry for a daughter, putting aside personal ambition to care for aging parents. These acts rarely earned triumphal processions through the forum, yet they formed the quiet backbone of Roman society. Perhaps that was the heaviest burden of Roman citizenship. No matter how tired, discouraged, or overwhelmed you felt, someone at home was relying on your strength, and tomorrow morning you were expected to rise and carry that responsibility all over again. By this point, Roman citizenship may sound less like a privilege and more like a full-time occupation. You paid your dues. You protected your family's honour. You competed with your neighbours. You lived beneath constant public scrutiny. You accepted responsibilities that often mattered more than your own comfort. So why did people still desperately want to become Roman citizens? Because despite all its pressures, Roman citizenship offered something almost priceless: security. In a world where kingdoms rose and fell with alarming regularity, Roman law provided stability that much of the ancient world could only envy. A Roman citizen possessed legal protections that non-citizens often lacked. If accused of a crime, a citizen had the right to a formal trial rather than immediate punishment. Under many circumstances, citizens could appeal serious legal decisions to higher authorities. Certain brutal penalties commonly inflicted upon slaves or foreigners, such as crucifixion, were generally forbidden for Roman citizens. Those rights could mean the difference between life and death. Merchants appreciated citizenship for another reason. The Roman Empire stretched from Britain to Syria, from the Rhine to North Africa. Roads, ports, laws, and a common currency allowed citizens to travel and conduct business across enormous distances with remarkable confidence. A trader from southern Italy could negotiate contracts in Gaul or Asia Minor, knowing that Roman law recognized his status. Opportunities expanded alongside the empire itself. Citizenship also opened political doors. Even if only a small minority ever reached high office, every Roman citizen theoretically belonged to the political community. Voting assemblies, public debates, military honours, and civic ceremonies reinforced the idea that citizens were partners in the Roman state, not merely subjects living beneath it. That sense of belonging mattered deeply. Perhaps nothing demonstrates this better than the reaction of those who finally received citizenship. In the year 212 after Christ, Emperor Caracalla issued the Constitutio Antoniniana, extending Roman citizenship to nearly every free inhabitant of the empire. Historians still debate his motives. Raising tax revenue was almost certainly one of them, but the decree reflected how valuable citizenship had become. People did not celebrate because life suddenly became easier. Taxes still existed. Responsibilities remained. The pressure did not disappear. Instead, millions gained something they had long desired: official membership in the most powerful political community of its age. That is perhaps the greatest paradox of Roman citizenship. The heavier its responsibilities became, the more valuable the title seemed. Because the Romans believed an honour earned through duty carried far greater meaning than one handed out freely. To them, citizenship was never simply a collection of legal rights. It was an identity,